Democracy's greatest gamble hung in the balance on a single weather report. June 5, 1944. Three Democratic leaders faced what Hitler's generals called impossible. The largest seaborne invasion in human history. While fascist dictators made decisions alone, Allied democracy demanded consensus from citizen soldiers who could refuse orders. Eisenhower held the fate of freedom in his hands as storms battered the Channel. June 6th, just hours away. Democracy's messiest moment became its finest hour when 150,000 free men chose to fight tyranny. One general's political courage would prove that democratic unity beats fascist efficiency every time. D-Day shattered Hitler's Atlantic Wall and proved democracies don't just survive, they triumph. This is the political story of how democratic decision-making saved the world. June 6, 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower stared at weather maps that could doom democracy itself. For 18 months, three democratic nations had planned Operation Overlord, the invasion that would either liberate Europe or hand Hitler his greatest victory. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Unlike every other major military decision of World War II, D-Day wasn't ordered by a dictator. It was a democratic gamble, debated in parliaments, questioned by free press, and ultimately executed by citizen soldiers who chose to fight. This is the political story of democracy's greatest risk, and why it matters more than ever as authoritarian powers threaten freedom today. Picture Hitler in his bunker. One man, absolute power, instant decisions. Now picture Eisenhower's headquarters, British generals arguing with American admirals, Canadian commanders questioning timing, free French leaders demanding inclusion. Democracy is messy. Democracy is slow. Democracy almost lost D-Day before it began. Roosevelt had to sell Congress on a plan that might kill 200,000 American boys. Churchill faced Parliament, demanding to know why British forces would take secondary roles. Stalin pressured from the East, threatening separate peace if the Western Allies delayed. In authoritarian systems, military planning happens in secret bunkers. In democracies, it happens under the scrutiny of elected representatives, free press, and public opinion. Every decision faced political opposition, public debate, and potential parliamentary revolt. Eisenhower wasn't just a general, he was a diplomat, managing the most complex political coalition in history. American industry, British intelligence, Canadian forces, Free French resistance, Polish pilots, Norwegian commandos. Each nation brought different agendas, different priorities, different definitions of victory. Compare this to German decision-making. Hitler's word was law. No debate, no dissent, no alternative perspectives. Fascist efficiency versus democratic chaos. Or so it seemed. June 3, 1944. The weather was deteriorating. Eisenhower faced the most consequential political decision since Lincoln chose to fight at Gettysburg. Delay the invasion, and Stalin might make separate peace with Hitler. Proceed in bad weather, and democracy's greatest army could drown in the English Channel. In Hitler's system, such decisions flowed from ideology and intuition. In Eisenhower's world, every choice required political justification to multiple democratic governments. The Supreme Allied commander had to balance American casualties against British strategic interests, Free French pride against Canadian tactical concerns. Franklin Roosevelt knew D-Day's failure would end his presidency and potentially hand the 1944 election to isolationists. Unlike dictators who rule through fear, democratic leaders face voters. Every dead soldier on Omaha Beach would be a headline in free newspapers, a question in Congress, a political liability in November. Yet, Roosevelt backed Eisenhower completely. Why? Because Democratic leaders understand that freedom requires risk, that political courage means choosing right over safe. Winston Churchill had survived votes of no confidence, press criticism, and public skepticism about British military competence. As D-Day approached, he faced a parliament increasingly war-weary, increasingly questioning why British boys should die for American strategies. But Churchill understood what authoritarians never grasp. Democratic legitimacy comes from consent of the governed. Hitler commanded obedience. Churchill had to earn support. That difference would prove decisive. While Eisenhower consulted meteorologists, Montgomery, Bradley, and a dozen other commanders, Hitler relied on astrology and intuition. The Führer had purged dissenting voices, surrounded himself with sycophants, eliminated institutional checks on his power. On June 6th, as Allied forces stormed Normandy, Hitler slept until noon. His generals feared waking him. In the most critical hours of the Atlantic Wall's defense, Nazi Germany's supreme leader was unreachable. Because authoritarian systems create fear of challenging authority, even when authority sleeps. Democratic decision-making looked chaotic compared to fascist efficiency. But that chaos was democracy's secret weapon. Multiple perspectives identified problems German groupthink missed. Open debate revealed flaws that Hitler's yes-men ignored. Citizen soldiers fighting for freedom proved more motivated than conscripts fighting for conquest. When things went wrong on D-Day, and everything did go wrong, democratic systems adapted. American Rangers improvised at Pointe du Hoc. British forces adjusted at Gold Beach. Canadian troops overcame unexpected resistance at Juno. Authoritarian armies follow orders. Democratic armies think for themselves. At 9:45 p.m., June 5th, Eisenhower made the call that saved democracy. Okay, let's go. Not because he was certain of success. Weather reports remained terrible. Not because he faced no opposition. Several commanders still objected. But because democratic leadership sometimes means acting despite uncertainty. Choosing courage over comfort, risking everything for principles worth defending. Compare this to authoritarian decision-making. Stalin's purges, Hitler's gambles, Mussolini's bluster. Dictators act from ego, fear, or ideology. Democratic leaders act from responsibility to something larger than themselves. As landing craft approached Normandy, they carried more than soldiers. They carried the hopes of every democracy on earth. Free men from free nations, fighting not for conquest but for liberation. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. The soldiers storming Omaha Beach could read uncensored newspapers about D-Day's risks. They'd heard congressional debates about casualties. They knew their families could vote out leaders who sent them to die. Yet they went anyway, because informed consent is democracy's ultimate strength. By nightfall June 6th, democracy had its foothold in fortress Europe. Not through fascist efficiency, but through democratic resilience. American industrial might, British intelligence, Canadian courage, free French determination. Coalition warfare at its finest. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, built by slave labor under authoritarian command, crumbled before free men fighting for free nations. The Wehrmacht, Nazi Germany's seemingly invincible war machine, began its retreat toward Berlin. D-Day proved something authoritarians never understood. Democracies don't just endure crisis. They transcend it. Free societies mobilize voluntarily what dictatorships must extract through force. Democratic unity, once achieved, becomes unstoppable. Today, Vladimir Putin makes decisions alone in his Kremlin bunker, just like Hitler in his eagle's nest. Xi Jinping rules China through fear and surveillance, eliminating dissent like Stalin eliminated kulaks. Iran's theocrats crush protests, like Mussolini crushed opposition. Meanwhile, democratic nations face the same choice Eisenhower faced: unity or isolation, courage or comfort, standing together against authoritarianism or hoping someone else will fight. Volodymyr Zelensky's Ukraine faces Putin's aggression with the same spirit American, British, and Canadian forces brought to Normandy. Free people defending freedom, democratic nations supporting democracy, coalition warfare against authoritarian expansion. The weapons are different: HIMARS instead of Sherman tanks, javelins instead of bazookas. But the choice remains identical. Will democracies unite against tyranny, or will they let authoritarianism advance unopposed? Xi Jinping watches Ukraine like Hitler watched Poland. He sees democratic hesitation as weakness, parliamentary debate as dysfunction, free press criticism as proof of Western decline. But Xi, like Hitler, misunderstands democracy's strength. Free societies seem weak because they admit doubts, debate options, question leaders. Authoritarian systems appear strong because they silence dissent, project certainty, punish criticism. D-Day proved which system endures when tested. Today's NATO alliance mirrors Eisenhower's D-Day coalition. Messy, complicated, politically challenging. American generals still coordinate with British intelligence, Canadian forces, and French strategy. Parliamentary debates still question military spending. Free press still criticizes alliance decisions. That's not NATO's weakness. That's NATO's strength. Because when democracies finally unite, as they did on June 6, 1944, and as they're doing today in support of Ukraine, they become an unstoppable force for freedom. D-Day succeeded not despite democratic decision-making, but because of it. The messy coalition politics, the parliamentary debates, the press criticism, the public skepticism, all of it made the invasion stronger, not weaker. Eisenhower's political courage proved that democratic leaders, when they choose to act, can move mountains and liberate continents. Roosevelt's electoral risk-taking showed that free nations will sacrifice for freedom. Churchill's parliamentary perseverance demonstrated that democracy finds its strength in crisis. Today, as authoritarianism rises from Moscow to Beijing, from Tehran to Pyongyang, we face Eisenhower's choice. Will we risk political comfort for democratic principles? Will we choose coalition building over isolation? Will we defend freedom before it's too late? D-Day's lesson echoes across 8 decades. Democracies don't just survive authoritarian challenges, they triumph over them. But only when democratic citizens choose courage over comfort, unity over division, and truth over propaganda. On June 6, 1944, democracy's greatest gamble became democracy's finest hour. Those young men storming Normandy's beaches carried more than rifles. They carried the hopes of every free nation, the dreams of every oppressed people, the future of human liberty itself. Today, that torch passes to us, not on distant beaches, but in voting booths, town halls, and parliamentary chambers. The defense of democracy begins with informed citizens who understand its value, appreciate its complexity, and will fight for its preservation. Because, as D-Day proved, democracy isn't just a system of government. It's a cause worth fighting for.